All right, and I need you to lock in for the next few minutes. What I'm about to walk you through is not commentary, it is not someone's opinion about the economy, and it is not the kind of content that shows up on your financial advisor's quarterly newsletter. This is about a convergence of policy timelines, funding mechanics, and cost structures that are quietly reshaping the retirement landscape for tens of millions of Americans right now, in real time, and almost entirely out of public view. Here is the starting point. The Social Security Trust Fund that pays retirement benefits, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Fund, the OASI, is now officially projected to reach depletion in the year 2032, not 2033, not the future, 2032. That is the revised estimate published in August 2025 by the Social Security Administration's own chief actuary, reflecting the combined impact of two pieces of legislation signed this year that accelerated the timeline by roughly 6 months to a full year. At the moment of depletion, and understand what that word means, the law does not allow the program to borrow, does not allow it to deficit spend, and does not allow it to pay out more than it collects in payroll tax revenue. What happens at that moment by statute is an automatic across-the-board benefit cut of approximately 23 to 24% for every single recipient, regardless of age, regardless of income, regardless of how long they paid into the system. A typical couple retiring in that window faces an $18,400 reduction in annual benefits. That is not a projection someone invented to generate engagement. That is the number published by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget based on the chief actuary's own estimates. And here is what makes this moment different from every previous warning that has been issued over the past 3 decades. The window to act is closing faster than the political system is moving. In 1983, Congress had 3 months before checks could not go out. Today, the window is approximately 7 years. And those 7 years are already in motion. But here is what most people do not understand about what is actually happening. The trust fund depletion is not the only mechanism compressing retirement income right now. It is happening simultaneously with a separate cost structure on the Medicare side that is moving in exactly the opposite direction. Medicare Part B premiums, the monthly amount deducted directly from your Social Security check before it ever reaches your bank account, just crossed $202.90 per month for 2026. That is a 9.7% increase from 2025. For the third consecutive year, the Part B premium has risen faster than the Social Security cost of living adjustment. The 2026 COLA was 2.8%. The Part B premium increase was nearly 10%. The gap between those two numbers is not a rounding error. That gap is the mechanism by which net retirement income is slowly compressed, even when the headline benefit number goes up. And the Medicare Trustees project that Part B premiums will approach $350 per month by 2034. That is before any additional policy changes. That is the baseline. I want you to understand the structural architecture of what is happening here, because once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. The retirement safety net as it was designed, and as most people in their 50s and 60s have planned around, is not disappearing all at once. It is thinning, quietly, along multiple dimensions simultaneously. And the people who are going to be hurt the most are the ones who built their entire retirement plan around a monthly benefit number they were told was guaranteed. Before we break down exactly how these mechanisms interact and what the decision points are going forward, I need to establish the analytical framework that makes sense of all of this. It is called retirement income sequence risk. And if you do not understand it, everything else I am about to tell you will seem like a collection of disconnected policy concerns. Sequence risk is the concept that in retirement, it is not just the total amount of money you have that determines whether your plan succeeds or fails. It is the order in which financial events occur. A 20% reduction in Social Security benefits at age 68 is a fundamentally different event than a 20% reduction at age 75, even if the dollar amount is identical. At 68, you still have the cognitive capacity, the physical capacity, and the time to adjust your spending, your withdrawal strategy, your part-time income, and your investment allocation. At 75, many of those adjustment levers are no longer available in the same way. The sequence in which income compression events hit a retirement plan determines the severity of the damage, and right now the sequence is converging. Trust fund pressure, rising Medicare costs, and the expiration of the new senior tax deduction, which sunsets in 2028, are all scheduled to arrive within the same 5 to 7 year window. This is not random. This is a predictable policy and actuarial convergence that has been documented in federal reports for years. The question is whether you are planning around it or whether you are still operating on assumptions that were accurate 10 years ago but are no longer current. Let us go back to 1983 because this situation has a direct historical parallel, and the parallel is instructive not because of how it resolved, but because of how long it took to get there and what happened in the meantime to the people who were not watching. In the late 1970s, Social Security's finances were deteriorating rapidly. The combination of a stagflation economy, lower wage growth, higher benefit indexing, and shifting demographic ratios had put the OASI Trust Fund on a trajectory toward depletion. By 1982, the fund balance had fallen to roughly one-third of its 1975 peak. The actuaries projected that without legislative action, the fund would be unable to pay scheduled benefits on time by July of 1983. That is how close it was, not years, months. President Reagan formed the National Commission on Social Security Reform, chaired by economist Alan Greenspan, which became known as the Greenspan Commission. Democrats and Republicans could not agree. Republicans refused to raise taxes. Democrats refused to cut benefits. The commission nearly collapsed entirely. It was only a back-channel negotiation between Senate members and White House staff, meeting privately in January of 1983 at a home in the Foxhall Road neighborhood of Washington, that produced a compromise. That compromise was signed into law on April 20th, 1983, barely 2 months before benefits would have been interrupted. The package included an acceleration of already scheduled payroll tax increases, a 6-month delay in cost of living adjustments, the gradual phase-in of income taxes on Social Security benefits for higher earners, a provision that had never existed before, and an increase in the full retirement age from 65 to 67, phased in over decades so that no one currently in or near retirement would feel the impact immediately. That retirement age provision, which added 2 full years to the threshold before anyone could collect unreduced benefits, did more to improve Social Security's long-term balance than almost any other element of the 1983 package. Here is what matters for today's analysis. The 1983 reform was not announced years in advance with a transparent legislative process. It was hammered out in a private room under extreme deadline pressure with 3 months to spare. The people who were most affected by the long-term provisions, specifically the increase in the retirement age, were young workers in their 20s and 30s who had no idea the rules of the system they were paying into were being changed. They did not find out for years, in many cases not until they were much closer to retirement. The lesson from 1983 is not that the system always gets fixed. The lesson is that when it gets fixed under deadline pressure, the people who are already retired or nearly retired are often protected by political necessity, while the cost is shifted onto those who are younger and have less immediate political leverage. That pattern is not specific to 1983. It is the structural logic of reform under pressure. Now let us move forward to the 1990s and early 2000s, because there is a second layer to this history that almost no one discusses when they talk about Social Security's current condition. When the 1983 reforms were enacted, they did not just stabilize the system for a few years, they actually generated large surpluses in the trust funds throughout the 1990s as the payroll tax increases took effect and the baby boom generation was in its peak earning years. Those surpluses were invested in special issue treasury bonds, and by 2009 the OASI Trust Fund held over $2.4 trillion in reserves. That reserve was the financial cushion that was supposed to carry the system through the retirement surge of the baby boom generation. What happened to that cushion is the part of the story that connects 1983 to today. The Social Security program has been spending down that reserve continuously since 2010, when annual program costs first exceeded annual payroll tax income. The reserve has been declining every year since then. It currently stands at approximately $2.72 trillion. By the end of the projection window, it reaches zero, and that is not a hypothetical. The Social Security Administration's trustees reported in 2025 that the combined program is running a cash flow deficit of $250 billion this year alone. Over the next decade, cumulative deficits are projected to total $3.6 trillion. The reserve was never meant to absorb that kind of sustained drawdown indefinitely. It was a bridge, and the bridge is being crossed right now at a rate that is faster than was projected even 5 years ago. 2 specific legislative events this year accelerated the timeline in ways that are still not fully understood by the general public. The Social Security Fairness Act, signed in January 2025, repealed 2 provisions, the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset, that had reduced benefits for certain public sector workers who also received pensions from jobs not covered by Social Security. The repeal was popular and politically bipartisan. It also added nearly $200 billion to the program's projected shortfall over the next 10 years. That is not a small number. That is enough to move the depletion date. The second event was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed on July 4th, 2025. The legislation included a new $6,000 senior deduction for individuals 65 and older, $12,000 for couples, available for tax years 2025 through 2028. The deduction was widely described as eliminating federal taxes on Social Security benefits for nearly 90% of recipients. That framing was later corrected by the Social Security Administration itself, which issued a clarification stating that the legislation provides an enhanced deduction rather than a repeal of the underlying tax mechanism. What the deduction actually does is reduce overall taxable income, which for most middle-income seniors does result in zero tax liability on their Social Security income. But the mechanism matters because the deduction phases out entirely for single filers above $175,000 in modified adjusted gross income and for married couples above $250,000. It is also temporary. It expires in 2028. And its cost, approximately $30 billion per year in reduced revenue, was identified by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget as one of the factors that moved the OASI depletion date forward by roughly 6 months. The deduction helped retirees in the short term. It accelerated the timeline for the system in the medium term. Both of those things are true simultaneously. Now let me walk you through exactly how the Medicare cost structure interacts with the Social Security benefit trajectory, because this is where the practical compression becomes visible at the household level. Most people think about Social Security benefits and Medicare costs as separate items. They are not separate at the household level. Medicare Part B premiums are deducted directly from Social Security checks. There is no intermediate step. The check that arrives in your account is already net of Part B. In 2026, the standard monthly Part B premium is $202.90. For a married couple where both spouses are enrolled, that is $405.80 per month, $4,169.60 per year, leaving Social Security before either spouse touches it. And that is only the standard rate. If the couple's combined modified adjusted gross income exceeds $218,000, which is a threshold that catches more middle-class households every year as the brackets adjust slowly for inflation, the Part B surcharge, technically called the Income-Related Monthly Adjustment Amount, or IRMAA, kicks in, and that deduction grows substantially. At the first income bracket above the threshold, total Part B costs per person rise to $284.10 per month. For a couple, that is $568.20 per month coming out of Social Security before spending begins. The Medicare Trustees' 2025 report projected that the standard Part B premium could reach approximately $350 per month by 2034. If that projection holds and a couple is both enrolled, that is $700 per month, $80,400 per year, deducted from Social Security annually in $2034 before the household sees a single dollar of that income. Meanwhile, the trust fund that pays the Social Security benefit itself is scheduled to reach depletion in approximately the same period, triggering the automatic cut. These two pressures are not independent, they are synchronized, they arrive at roughly the same time. The retirement income that most households are counting on is being compressed from both ends simultaneously. There is a third mechanism that operates more slowly but compounds over time in ways that are extremely difficult to catch if you are not watching carefully. It involves the COLA formula itself. The cost of living adjustment for Social Security is calculated using the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, the CPIW. This index measures price changes experienced by a particular demographic profile of working Americans. It is not designed to reflect the spending patterns of retired households. The Senior Citizens League, a nonprofit advocacy group that tracks this annually, has documented for years that the basket of goods retirees actually buy, weighted heavily toward medical costs, housing, prescription drugs, and services, inflates faster than the CPIW. Over the past 2 decades, the purchasing power of the average Social Security benefit has declined by an estimated 20% in real terms when measured against what retirees actually spend, even with COLA adjustments applied each year. The adjustments are mathematically positive, they are purchasing power negative. The gap between the nominal benefit number and the real spending capacity of that benefit has been widening since the early 2000s. This is not a one-year problem. This is a compounding problem. And it interacts directly with both the trust fund trajectory and the Medicare premium escalation to create a structural squeeze that no single policy change has addressed. Let us now talk about what the actual decision points are going forward, because the unresolved questions matter more than the resolved ones at this stage. The first unresolved question is whether Congress will act before the 2032 depletion date, and if so, what form that action will take. The historical record is instructive. In 1983, Congress acted with 3 months to spare. Not years, not decades, 3 months. Today, the window is approximately 7 years. 7 years sounds like a long time. In legislative terms, with the current political environment, it is not. The options available to Congress are essentially 4: raise the payroll tax rate, lift or eliminate the taxable wage ceiling currently set at $176,100 in 2025, reduce the level of scheduled benefits, or some combination of all 3. Each of those options has significant distributional consequences and significant political resistance from different parts of the electorate. The longer Congress waits, the fewer years remain to phase changes in gradually. If action comes in 2031, changes would have to be much more abrupt than if action comes in 2027. The 1983 lesson is precisely that abruptness falls disproportionately on those who are too close to retirement to adjust their plans, but not yet old enough to have political protection from immediate changes. That is the cohort in their mid to late 50s today. The second unresolved question is what happens to the IRMAA income thresholds for Medicare surcharges as nominal incomes continue to rise. These thresholds have historically adjusted for inflation, but the adjustment has consistently lagged behind wage growth and investment income growth. Each year, a larger share of middle-class retirees crosses into the first IRMAA bracket and begins paying the surcharge. This process is gradual and largely invisible until it shows up on a retiree's Social Security payment as a reduced deposit. There is no announcement. There is no notification that your income has crossed a threshold and your Medicare deduction has increased. You simply receive a smaller check than you received the year before. That is the mechanism. It is structural. It is embedded in the existing framework, and it will continue operating on its current trajectory unless specific legislative action changes the bracket structure. The third unresolved question is what happens after the $6,000 senior deduction expires in 2028. The provision was written with a 4-year sunset. It covers tax years 2025 through 2028. If it is not extended by Congress, retirees who adjusted their tax planning, their withdrawal strategy, or their income sequencing based on that deduction will face a reversion to the prior tax treatment in 2029. For a middle-income retiree couple relying on the deduction to reduce their taxable income, the expiration represents a real income reduction, even if their gross benefit has not changed. Whether Congress will extend it, modify it, or allow it to expire is a question that is genuinely unresolved. It was passed as part of a reconciliation package with significant fiscal constraints. Its renewal is not guaranteed. Here is what all of this means in practical terms for anyone who is currently planning a retirement in the next 5 to 15 years. The retirement income architecture that most people are planning around has 3 distinct pressure points operating simultaneously. The gross Social Security benefit is on a trajectory toward a scheduled reduction, the specific timing of which now appears to be late 2032. The net benefit, what actually arrives in the household account after Medicare deductions, is being compressed by Part B premium increases that have consistently outpaced the COLA, and the purchasing power of that net benefit, the real-world spending capacity it represents, has been quietly eroding against retiree-specific inflation for over 2 decades. None of these pressure points requires a crisis to materialize. None of them requires a recession, a financial panic, or a policy failure. They are built into the existing legislative and actuarial structure of the programs as they currently stand. They are the scheduled outcome of current law, absent congressional action. Let me make this concrete with a household example, because the numbers become much more tangible when you attach them to a specific situation rather than letting them remain abstract policy figures. Consider a married couple, both 58 years old today, planning to retire at 67. Based on their earnings history, they are projecting a combined Social Security benefit of $5,200 per month at their full retirement age. That is a reasonable middle-class outcome for 2 people with solid work histories. Now run the numbers forward under current law. In 2026, Medicare Part B for 2 enrollees costs $480 per month before any IRMAA surcharges. If they retire in 2033 at age 67, and if Part B premiums have increased along the trajectory projected by the Medicare trustees, the deduction from their combined benefit could easily exceed $600 per month at that point. That means approximately $7,200 per year, more than 1 full month of benefits, is absorbed by Medicare before their money reaches their account. On top of that, if the trust fund reduction takes effect around the same time, the 23 to 24% statutory cut reduces their gross benefit by approximately $1,200 per month. After Medicare deductions, their net monthly household income from Social Security could be closer to $3,400 than $5,200. That is a $1,800 per month gap relative to their planning assumption. Over a 25-year retirement, that gap compounds to a number that reshapes the entire plan. That is not a catastrophe scenario. That is the current law scenario with no additional adverse developments. And it is the scenario that most retirement projections produced 5 to 10 years ago did not incorporate, because the trust fund timeline was still far enough out that planners were treating full scheduled benefits as a baseline. The planning response to this situation is not panic. Panic does not extend a trust fund. Panic does not reduce a Medicare premium. Panic does not change the statutory COLA formula. The response is analytical sequencing. It means understanding which of your retirement income sources are policy dependent and subject to scheduled changes, which are contractually fixed, and which are variable and within your control. It means understanding that the conventional rule of thumb, that Social Security replaces approximately 40% of pre-retirement income for middle earners, was calculated under assumptions about benefit levels that are now on a legally documented trajectory toward reduction. It means building a plan that explicitly accounts for the possibility, not the certainty, but the documented legal possibility of a benefit reduction in the early to mid-2030s. That means examining the role of tax-deferred and tax-exempt accounts in a retirement income plan, not just as savings vehicles, but as sequencing tools that allow you to manage taxable income in retirement, to minimize IRMAA exposure and optimize the net value of your Social Security benefit. It means understanding the difference between claiming Social Security at 62 versus 67 versus 70 in the context of a trust fund that may deliver reduced benefits for a significant portion of a retirement that could last 25 to 30 years. The mathematics of the claiming decision changes meaningfully when the expected benefit stream after a certain year includes a potential 23% reduction. That calculation is not the same calculation it was in 2015 or even in 2022. There is also a tax dimension to this that most people have not yet worked through. The $6,000 senior deduction that currently helps middle-income retirees reduce or eliminate their federal tax liability on Social Security income expires in 2028. Between now and 2028, a retiree who is managing their taxable income carefully, keeping modified adjusted gross income below the $75,000 threshold for single filers or $150,000 for couples, can significantly reduce or eliminate their federal tax bill on Social Security income. That is a real and meaningful planning window. It is also a temporary one. Beginning in 2029, absent a congressional extension, the deduction reverts to its prior level and the provisional income thresholds for Social Security taxation, $25,000 for single filers and $32,000 for married couples, reassert themselves in full. Those thresholds have not been inflation adjusted since they were set in 1984. A retiree with $45,000 in combined income from Social Security, a pension, and a small IRA withdrawal is far more likely to have 85% of their Social Security benefits subject to federal tax today than Congress intended when it wrote those thresholds 40 years ago. This is a structural feature of the tax code that creates ongoing, largely invisible erosion of net retirement income for a growing share of middle-class retirees. Understanding where you fall relative to those thresholds and what account sequencing strategies are available to manage them is a planning question that is worth working through before the deduction window closes. There are several things that are worth understanding clearly as you think through this. The worker-to-beneficiary ratio, which is the ratio of people paying into Social Security to people receiving benefits, stood at more than 5 to 1 when the program began and more than 3 to 1 as recently as 2010. By 2024, it had declined to approximately 2.8 to 1. The Social Security trustees project it will continue declining toward 2.5 to 1 by mid-century. This is the demographic arithmetic that drives the funding equation. There is no policy lever that changes this arithmetic quickly. Immigration levels affected at the margins, labor force participation rates affected at the margins, but the core dynamic, a large cohort of baby boomers moving through retirement drawing down the reserve faster than the workforce behind them can replenish it, is a structural condition, not a policy failure. We are currently in what demographers and retirement researchers have called peak 65, the period from 2024 to 2027, during which more than 4.1 million Americans turn 65 each year. That is the largest wave of retirements in the nation's history. And it is happening precisely as the reserve approaches its final years of adequacy. The policy environment is also worth framing precisely. There is currently no bipartisan legislative effort underway to address Social Security solvency. There is significant disagreement between the two parties about whether to address the shortfall primarily through revenue increases or benefit adjustments. There is no Greenspan-style commission formed or proposed. The 1983 process, which was itself nearly a failure, required an extraordinary degree of informal back-channel negotiation between senior White House officials and congressional leaders who trusted each other personally. That kind of negotiating infrastructure does not currently exist around this issue. What is unresolved is not whether the math is understood. The math is understood. What is unresolved is when and whether the political system will act, and in what form. Here's the question I want you to sit with after this video, and I genuinely want to hear your perspective in the comments because the range of situations people are in is wide, and the conversation this generates is often the most useful part of this process. If you are currently within 10 years of your intended retirement date, have you run a scenario in your retirement plan that explicitly models a 20% reduction in your projected Social Security benefit beginning in 2032 or 2033? Not as a worst case. As a documented, actuarially projected possibility under current law. And if that scenario produces a gap in your plan, what is the lever you still have available to close it? That is the analytical question that separates a retirement plan that is robust from one that is fragile. I want to hear where you stand. Drop it in the comments. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of how these systems actually work and how they interact with each other, not just individually, but as a sequence of events, then make sure you are subscribed and have notifications on, because the follow-on to this video will go deeper into the Social Security claiming strategy decision under these specific conditions, including what the crossover analysis looks like when you incorporate a potential trust fund reduction into the break-even calculation. That is a conversation that most retirement planning resources have not yet updated for the current timeline. We are going to do that here. And if you know someone who is in the planning phase of their retirement and operating on assumptions that were formed 5 or 10 years ago, share this with them. Not because the situation is urgent in a way that requires immediate action today, but because the decisions that matter most in retirement planning are made years before retirement, and the window to make the right ones with the right information is not unlimited. I will see you in the next one.